She was 25 when Conrad Ellis served her notice to quit their shared flat. The notice was not delivered by hand. It was not preceded by an argument or a tearful confession. It was a formal, legally binding document sent by a solicitor, which arrived in the post at the archival conference she was attending in Edinburgh. It gave her 7 days to vacate the property they had shared for 3 years. When she returned to London, a day early, the key no longer worked in the lock. On the top step of the handsome Victorian townhouse, beside the neatly pruned bay tree in its terracotta pot, sat her 2 archive cases. They were professional-grade, reinforced aluminum, designed to protect fragile manuscripts from fire and water. They contained her tools, her bone folders, her lifting knives, her Japanese tissue papers, her bespoke weights filled with lead shot. Inside one, tucked into a pocket meant for schematics, was a typed letter. The letter was efficient. It detailed the dissolution. He had closed their joint account, transferring what he calculated to be his exact share, plus reimbursement for bills he had paid in the last quarter, into his own private one. The balance remaining for her was £197.42. He had itemized the contents of the flat. He took the Danish mid-century sofa they had chosen together. He took the framed gallery prints from their trip to St. Ives. He took the Le Creuset cookware and the German knives. He took the shared laptop and the Sonos speakers. He took everything with a clear and quantifiable market value. He took everything he could document, everything he could photograph for an insurance claim. He wrote that he hoped she would understand this was for the best, a clean break being the most humane approach. He wished her well in her future endeavors. The signature was not handwritten. It was his scanned digital signature, crisp and impersonal. He had forgotten one thing, or rather, he had never known of it. In all their conversations about the future, about assets and 5-year plans and property portfolios, she had never once mentioned the small stone building on a quiet lane in North Yorkshire. He had, on a drive through the Cotswolds once, gestured at a redundant chapel and called such places preservation liabilities. Charming, but with no viable economic future. She had filed that assessment away. She had kept her one inheritance, her one true thing, safe from his calculations. He never asked about the specific quality of her quietness or where it came from. He never asked about her father. She had grown up understanding silence the way some children grow up understanding music. It was not an absence of sound to her, but a presence. It had texture and weight and color. There was the heavy, velvet silence of a library reading room, the thin, brittle silence of an unheated church, and the deep, resonant silence of the Quaker meeting house her father had tended. This last one was the silence of her childhood, the foundational silence against which all other noises were measured. It was a silence composed of old stone, ancient oak, and the patient breathing of the dale outside. It was the silence of waiting, not for a sermon or a song, but for a truth to settle in the heart. Her father, Samuel Hadley, had been a master of this particular quiet. He was a manuscript conservator and bookbinder by trade, a man whose entire life was a study in patience. He could spend a week re-sewing the signatures of a single 17th-century folio, his large, capable hands moving with a watchmaker's delicacy. He spoke little, but when he did, his words had the carefully considered weight of objects placed with intention. He had inherited the stewardship of the Low Gill meeting house from his own father, who had inherited it from his. The Hadleys were not its owners, not in the way Conrad would have understood. The property was technically held by the district meeting, but the Quaker community in that particular dale had dwindled over the generations, shrinking from a congregation that filled the benches to a handful of elderly friends, and finally to just Samuel himself. And he was its last caretaker, its last member, the final keeper of its particular silence. He did not see this as a failure or a loss, but as the natural turning of a season. "Things have their time, Wren," he had told her once, running his hand over the worn surface of the elder's bench. Our job is just to see them through it with grace. For him, grace meant maintaining the roof slates, repointing the stone when the winter frosts bit too deep, and keeping the simple wooden interior free from damp and decay. It was a responsibility he bore not as a burden, but as a privilege, a quiet conversation with the past. He had become a widower when Wren was only 7, and in the wake of her mother's sudden passing, he had poured his love and his grief into 2 things, his daughter and the meeting house. They became intertwined in Wren's memory. Summers were spent not on holidays abroad, but in the Dale. While her father worked, she explored. She learned the names of the wildflowers in the small, overgrown burial ground. She learned the feel of the different tools in his workshop, the particular smell of the beeswax and turpentine he used to polish the benches, the satisfying heft of a well-made book. He taught her his trade not through formal lessons, but by letting her be near. She learned to pare leather, to mix wheat starch paste, to handle paper so old it felt like solidified light. She learned to sit quietly, to observe, to wait. She learned the value of things that could not be bought or sold, the worth that accrued in an object through touch and time and care. She met Conrad at a university mixer. He was studying urban planning, and he was fascinated by her degree in the conservation of historic artifacts. He was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He asked questions. He listened to her answers. He seemed to see her, to value the quiet competence she had learned from her father. He was ambitious and organized, and his structured view of the world felt like a safe harbor after the drift of student life. He created plans, made lists, set goals. For a time, his certainty was a comfort. He mapped out their life together with the same precision he used for a new housing development. They would live in London for 5 years while he established his career at a prestigious firm. They would save a deposit for a flat. They would travel to cities, not the countryside. He saw her work as a charming, intellectual hobby, something that made her interesting at dinner parties. He didn't understand that for her, it was a vocation, a continuation of that conversation with the past her father had taught her to value. He saw the world as a series of problems to be solved, assets to be managed. He kept spreadsheets. He tracked their joint spending to the penny. He logged their shared chores on a whiteboard in the kitchen. He scheduled their social life in a shared digital calendar. Her father had died 2 years before she received Conrad's letter. A quiet heart attack in his workshop. He had left her everything, which wasn't much in the way Conrad would measure it. His tools, his books, and the key to the meeting house. When she had told Conrad about her father's death, he had been perfectly sympathetic. He'd brought her tea, canceled their dinner plans, and said all the right things. But he never asked about what her father had left her. He assumed there was a will, a solicitor, a sum of money to be dealt with. When she simply said, "He left me his tools," Conrad had nodded, accepting the statement at face value, never probing the deeper meaning, never asking what else a man like her father might have considered a legacy. The meeting house remained her secret, a quiet, unitemized asset in the back of her mind. The train journey north was a slow, unwinding thread pulling her back in time. She left King's Cross in a grey London drizzle and watched as the urban sprawl gave way to the manicured fields of the home counties, then the industrial scars of the Midlands, and finally the vast open landscapes of the north. She had her 2 aluminum cases, a small rucksack with a change of clothes, and the 197 pounds Conrad had left her. She got off at the small, unmanned station at Garsdale, the highest in England, and the wind that hit her felt like a different element entirely from the city air she had been breathing. It was clean and cold and smelled of wet earth and sheep. She took a local bus that rattled its way down the dale, the dry stone walls flowing past the window like seams stitching the fields together. The solicitor's office was in the market town of Hawes. Mr. Sedgwick was a man in his late 70s with kind eyes and hands spotted with age. He had been her father's friend, a fellow Quaker who had long since moved to the larger meeting in the town. He greeted her not with pity, but with a quiet, steady warmth. He had the deed, a simple document confirming the district meeting's grant of stewardship to her, following the line from her father. And he had the key. It was heavy, made of dark, pitted iron, the bit worn smooth with generations of use. "Your father was a good man, Wren," Mr. Sedgwick said, placing the key in her palm. "He kept the faith in his own way. The place has been empty these last 2 years. I've had a lad go and check on it now and again, but it'll need seeing to." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "You have the hands for it. You're Samuel's daughter." It was a statement of fact, a validation that settled somewhere deep inside her. A taxi took her the last few miles, up a narrow lane flanked by ancient hawthorns, their branches twisted into fantastical shapes by the wind. And then she saw it. The Low Gill Meeting House stood in a small enclosure of land, surrounded by a low stone wall. It was smaller than she remembered, a simple, rectangular building of dark, weathered stone with a slate roof that seemed to have settled into the landscape like a sleeping animal. It had no steeple, no bell, no stained glass. Its only adornments were the 4 tall, plain windows on its long side and the simple, dark-painted wooden door. The paint was peeling, and a few slates looked loose on the roof. The small burial ground to the side was overgrown with long grass and wildflowers, the few simple headstones tilting at gentle angles. It looked neglected, but it also looked eternal. It had what her father called good bones. It had integrity. The iron key turned in the lock with a loud, grating sound that echoed in the quiet lane. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, and she was met with the smell of cold stone, damp air, and old wood. The interior was a single, simple room. Light fell in pale shafts from the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. At the far end stood the elder's bench, a high-backed seat on a raised platform. Facing it were rows of plain, dark wooden benches, their surfaces worn to a deep, lustrous patina by generations of quiet worshippers. A simple cast-iron stove stood cold in one corner. There were cobwebs in the rafters and a fine layer of dust over everything. A scattering of dead leaves had blown in under the door. It was empty, cold, and forgotten. And it was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. It was hers. She spent the first hour just walking the space, running her hand over the cool, uneven plaster of the walls, tracing the grain of the wooden benches. She sat on the elder's bench, the place where her father and grandfather had sat. She remembered her father telling her it was the oldest part of the building, made from a single oak tree that had been felled on that very spot in the late 1600s to make way for the meeting house. He had been working on it the summer before he died, painstakingly strengthening a joint in the backrest. He had been unusually protective of his work, shooing her away playfully when she tried to see what he was doing. "A master craftsman never reveals all his secrets," he had said with a rare smile. Curiosity piqued by the memory, she examined the backrest more closely. The wood was dark, almost black with age. She ran her fingers along the panels, feeling for the joint he had been repairing. And there it was, a seam so perfectly executed it was almost invisible. But when she pressed on it, in the specific way she had seen him test the strength of a book's spine, there was a faint click. A section of the backrest, no bigger than a large book, came loose in her hand. It was a false panel. Behind it, in the cavity, sat a small, sealed tin box, the kind that used to hold biscuits or tea. It was heavy. She carried the tin to a pool of light from one of the windows and pried open the lid with the tip of one of her conservation knives. The first thing she saw was a letter, folded neatly on top. The paper was old, creamy, and watermarked, a sheet from an 18th century meeting house register her father must have kept. The handwriting was his, a neat architectural script, precise and clear. She unfolded it. It began without salutation. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have come home. I hope you were not in a hurry to find it. I hope life was good to you first, but I know that life is not always good, and so I left this for you. This place is not an asset, Wren. It is an anchor. It has held our family for a long time, and now it will hold you. Do not think of it as a burden. Think of it as a responsibility, which is a much lighter thing to carry. The work will steady your hands and quiet your mind. The roof will need seeing to first. John Masterman in Hawes is a good man, an honest roofer. Tell him you are Samuel Hadley's daughter. He will know what to do. The windows will need repainting before next winter. Mr. Airy, the woodwright in Askrigg, has the right linseed oils. He understands old wood. This is all the advice I will give you on the practicalities. You have the knowledge. You have my hands and your mother's good sense. You will know what to do." She paused, her throat tight. She could hear his voice in the words, calm and steady. She read on. "Underneath this letter is a contingency. Your great-grandmother started it, during the war. A little put-by, just in case. Your grandfather added to it. And I did too. It is not a fortune. It is not meant to make you rich. It is meant to give you a choice. It is enough to begin again. Use it wisely, but do not be afraid to use it. Money is a tool, nothing more. Its only real value is the freedom it can buy. Freedom from fear, freedom to choose your own way. The real inheritance is the building itself and the silence it holds. Learn to listen to it. It has held the hopes and sorrows of good people for 300 years. It will hold yours, too. Be happy, my Wren, your loving father." With trembling hands, she lifted the letter. Beneath it, nestled in old cotton wool, were bundles of old banknotes tied with string, and under the notes, a heavy canvas bag. She loosened the drawstring and poured the contents into her palm. Gold sovereigns, dozens of them, gleaming with a soft, buttery light. She sat there on the dusty floor, the letter in one hand and a gold coin in the other, and she counted. She counted the notes, she counted the coins, calculating their value. Her father was right. It was not a fortune. But it was enough. It was more than enough to begin again. The next morning she called John Masterman. His voice was gruff, full of the Yorkshire dialect she hadn't heard in years. When she said her name, there was a pause. "Samuel Hadley's girl?" he said, his tone softening. "Aye, I remember you. A little thing with big eyes, always watching. Your father was a fine man, a proper gentleman. What can I do for you?" She explained about the roof. He said he'd be over that afternoon to take a look. Masterman was a tall, wiry man, with a face weathered like the local stone. He walked around the meeting house once, then climbed a ladder to the roof, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his life at a height. He came down a few minutes later, wiping his hands on his trousers. "It's not as bad as it looks," he announced. "The main timbers are sound. Your father saw to that. But you've lost a good few slates in the last couple of winters, and the flashing around the chimney stack is starting to go. It's a job needs doing right." He quoted her a price. It was fair, she knew, far less than a London firm would have charged. "I'll start next week if that suits," he said, "and I'll take you on as my laborer. It'll keep the cost down. Your father taught you how to work, I'll be bound." For the next 2 weeks, Wren's life found a new rhythm, one dictated by weather and daylight. She was up at dawn, brewing tea on a small camping stove she'd bought in Hawes. Masterman would arrive in his battered pickup, and they would spend the day on the roof. She learned the weight and feel of the heavy Burlington slate, the particular technique for nailing them in place without cracking them, the smell of the hot bitumen they used to seal the flashing. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of paper and vellum, became calloused and strong. Her muscles ached at night in a way that was deeply satisfying. Masterman worked mostly in silence, but sometimes he would share stories of her father, of conversations they'd had over the years about the weather, about local history, about the right way to do a job. "He never cut a corner, your dad," Masterman said one afternoon, squinting at the line of new slates. "He believed a thing worth doing was worth doing well. Not many like that left." From her vantage point on the roof, Wren could see the entire dale laid out below her, a patchwork of greens and grays under a vast, shifting sky. She felt a sense of ownership, of belonging, that she had never felt in the pristine London flat. This was real. This was hers. Once the roof was watertight, she turned her attention to the interior. The first task was cleaning. She spent a solid week, just scrubbing. She swept out the years of dust and leaves. She washed the tall windows, inside and out, letting the clear northern light flood the room. The glass was old, full of ripples and imperfections that made the view outside soft and painterly. She scrubbed the wide, bare floorboards with buckets of hot water and soap, kneeling on the hard wood until her knees were bruised, watching as the ingrained dirt lifted and the pale, clean grain of the pine reappeared. The work was monotonous, repetitive, and deeply meditative. With every sweep of the brush, every wipe of the cloth, she felt she was not just cleaning a building, but clearing a space inside herself. She was washing away the residue of her life with Conrad, the film of his expectations and his judgments. Then she began to polish the wood. She called Mr. Airy in Askrigg, the woodwright her father had mentioned. He was a small, quiet man who smelled of linseed oil and sawdust. He came and looked at the benches, running his hand over them with a reverence that reminded her of her father. "Good English oak," he murmured. "You can't get wood like this anymore. Your father knew how to care for it." He mixed her a large batch of his own traditional polish, a fragrant concoction of beeswax, turpentine, and linseed oil, and showed her how to apply it, working it into the wood in small, circular motions with a soft cloth. The task took her another 2 weeks. She worked her way along each bench, front and back, top to bottom. The scent filled the small building, a clean, sweet, and ancient smell. As she worked, the wood seemed to come alive under her hands. The deep, almost black color of the oak softened, and a rich, warm patina emerged, glowing with a soft internal light. She was not just polishing wood. She was touching the history of the place. She felt the presence of the generations of people who had sat on these benches, their hands resting where hers now worked. She was polishing away the neglect, revealing the beauty that had been there all along. It was the same work she did on manuscripts, removing the dirt and damage of time to reveal the original, true thing beneath. Here she was the manuscript, and the building, and the conservator all at once. By the end of her first month, the meeting house was transformed. It was not new and it was not perfect. It was clean and sound and filled with light. The silence within its walls felt different now, no longer the cold silence of abandonment, but the warm, waiting silence she remembered from her childhood. She had set up a small living space for herself in one corner, with a camp bed, her stove, and a small table. In the other corner, she unpacked her aluminum cases and set up her conservation workshop. The long, flat top of one of the benches was a perfect work surface. She had found a purpose that was entirely her own, rooted in her own history. Her money was dwindling, but her father's letter had given her the courage she needed. She took the bus into the county town and went to the records office, a place she had visited with her father as a child. The head archivist, a woman named Mrs. Cartwright, looked up from her desk as Wren entered. She recognized her immediately. "Wren Hadley. Goodness me. I heard you were back in the Dale. You look just like your father." They talked for an hour about her work in London, about his passing, about the meeting house. On a whim, Wren asked if they had any need for a freelance conservator. Mrs. Cartwright's eyes lit up. "Our last one retired 2 years ago," she said. "The county budget is tight, but we have a backlog of parish registers and estate maps that are in a desperate state. I can't offer you a full-time position, but I could give you part-time contract work, 2 or 3 days a week, if that would suit." It was perfect. It would provide enough income to live on, while leaving her time for her own project, the meeting house. Her new life settled into a gentle, repeating pattern. 3 days a week, she would take the early bus to the archives and immerse herself in the delicate work of mending torn paper and restoring faded ink. She loved the quiet focus of the work, the tangible connection to the lives of people long gone. The other 4 days were for the meeting house. She began the slow, painstaking process of restoring the original wooden benches, not just polishing them, but checking every joint, securing every peg, treating the wood with the reverence her father had taught her. It was a project that would take years, not months, and she found a deep contentment in its unhurried pace. As the seasons turned, from the bright, clear days of summer to the golden melancholy of autumn, the community began to find her. An elderly woman, one of the last Quakers who remembered meeting in the building as a child, knocked on the door one afternoon. She introduced herself as Elspeth. She brought a freshly baked loaf of bread and a pot of homemade jam. She told Wren stories about her grandfather, about the summer picnics the meeting used to hold in the small yard. A local historian came by, having heard that Samuel Hadley's daughter was back. He was writing a book on nonconformist chapels in the Dales and was thrilled to see the building being cared for. He spent a whole afternoon with her, taking notes, his delight in the simple architecture infectious. Mr. Sedgwick, the solicitor, would sometimes drive out on a Sunday and sit with her for a while, sharing a flask of tea in comfortable silence. She was no longer just Samuel's daughter. She was becoming Wren Hadley of the Low Gill Meeting House. She was being woven back into the fabric of the place, not as a visitor, but as a resident, a steward. Winter arrived, blanketing the dale in snow. The meeting house was cold, heated only by the small wood-burning stove she had installed in the old chimney. Some days she would be snowed in for a day or two, but she never felt lonely. She had her work, her books, and the deep, comforting silence. She felt more connected, more herself in that simple stone room than she ever had in the bustling heart of London. The world and its demands felt very far away. Spring came late, but with a sudden, vibrant rush of green. The daffodils she had planted in the autumn pushed through the soil in the burial ground, and the hawthorns in the lane burst into a cloud of white blossom. It was on a bright, cool morning in late April, almost a year to the day since she had arrived, that she heard the sound of an unfamiliar car. It was a sleek, dark gray saloon, the kind of car that looked utterly alien on the narrow, muddy lane. It pulled up carefully, and a man got out. It was Conrad. He wore a long, beautifully tailored cashmere coat and expensive leather shoes that were entirely unsuited to the countryside. He looked thinner than she remembered, and there were lines of tiredness around his eyes. He stood for a long moment, just looking at the meeting house. She watched him from the open doorway, her hands covered in a fine layer of sawdust. He was taking in the solid, newly pointed stone, the perfect lines of the restored slate roof, the clean, clear glass of the windows. His face wore an expression of profound bewilderment, the look of a man confronting a set of data that refused to fit his models. He saw her then and walked slowly towards the door. She did not move to greet him. She simply stood her ground, a sanding block still in her hand. "Wren," he said. His voice was quiet. "Conrad," she replied. Her own voice was steady, calm. He stepped inside, his polished shoes scuffing on the clean floorboards. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the simple, profound beauty of the space. He saw the neat stack of wood by the stove, the row of her father's tools arranged on a shelf, the bench she was in the middle of restoring, its stripped-back oak glowing in the morning light. I didn't know about this place," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw not confidence, but a deep, unsettling confusion in his eyes. "My research. It wasn't thorough enough." The word research hung in the quiet air. It was so perfectly him. He saw his failure not as a failure of heart or of empathy, but as a failure of due diligence. She turned back to the bench she was working on, and slowly, deliberately, began to sand the smooth, curved armrest. The rhythmic scraping sound was the only noise in the room. "You never asked about my father," she said, her voice even, not looking at him. "Not really. You never asked what he was like, or what he loved, or what he left behind." He had no answer to that. He watched her work for a long time. He saw the competence in her hands, the easy, practiced way she held the tool. He saw the quiet assurance in her posture. This was a version of her he had never seen, had never even imagined existed. The quiet woman he had known, whose skills he had considered a quaint hobby, was the person who had created this. This solid, beautiful, real place. "Is there?" he began, and then faltered. He gestured vaguely, a motion that encompassed her, the building, the life she had made. "Is there anything that can be repaired?" She stopped sanding. She placed the block down carefully on the bench and turned to face him fully. She looked at him, at his expensive coat and his tired eyes and his complete inability to comprehend the currency of this place. There was no anger in her, no bitterness, only a calm, quiet clarity. "No," she said. It was not a harsh word. It was a simple statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the stone walls around them. "No, there isn't," he nodded slowly. He understood. He could not argue with the finality in her voice because it was a logic he recognized, the clean, unequivocal closing of an account. He looked around the room one last time, as if trying to memorize the details of a place he would never see again. Then he turned and walked out of the door, got into his expensive car, and drove away. She watched until the car was out of sight, then she picked up her sanding block and went back to work. That evening she did not light the lamp. She sat on the elder's bench, the one her father had repaired, the one where he had hidden her future. The sun had set and the room was filled with a soft, gray twilight. Outside, an owl called from the trees down by the beck. She sat in the gathering dark, listening. She listened to the silence. It was the silence of her ancestors, the silence of patient work and quiet faith. It was the silence of stone and wood and the turning earth. It was no longer an inheritance from her father. It was her own. She had earned it. She had rebuilt it. It was the foundation of her life. Conrad had taken everything he could count. He had taken the balance in the bank account, the thread count of the sheets, the market value of the art on the walls. He had taken the objects, the data points, the things that could be entered onto a spreadsheet. He had itemized her life with him and calculated its worth. In his thorough, methodical accounting, he had stripped her of everything he understood to be of value. He had left behind the only thing that mattered. He had left the years of her father's care, the weight of the iron key, the wisdom in the handwritten letter. He had left the strength of the old oak, the resilience of the stone, the deep, resonant quiet that held 300 years of peace. He had left her a legacy he was incapable of measuring, and therefore incapable of seeing. He forgot the quiet stone meeting house her father left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.